On the CANSA Couch with Megan and Kudzai.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all today to Cancer on the Couch. And we are releasing this episode ahead of World Cancer Research Day, which is highlighted each year on the 24th of September. Today it gives me great pleasure not only to have my co-host with me, Kudzai. Hello, welcome, how are you?
Hi Megan, I'm good, thank you. Very lovely to be back again on the CANSA Couch and looking forward to this episode today.
Very excited, and with us, joining us here is Dr. Mahtaab Hayat. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Megan. It's really lovely to be here.
Thank you. And you're a lecturer and a researcher at the University of the Witwatersrand School of Molecular and Cell Biology. You also are a lead author of a groundbreaking Nature publication from one of Cancer's Type A funded projects. And I'm just going to also mention that, which I think is exciting. It is called, and we're going to tell you all about this today. And it really is, it's what we call genome-wide, and we'll explain all these terms, association study that identifies the common different variants associated with breast cancer in South African Black women. Now, we're going to unpack this as well, but importantly, I'd also like to just include that Dr. Hayat was actually called, is it the Sowetan Woman of the Year for Science 2025? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Congratulations. That's very exciting. So it's really lovely to have you here today. And I'm going to hand over to my co-host because I know she's got some questions that she'd like to fire at you to teach us more about this, because we find it, in actual fact, a very interesting topic, but from my side, I also find some of the terminology a bit daunting. So I'm hoping to learn quite a bit of how this all works today. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Megan. And as you said, this is right on time for World Cancer Research Day that is commemorated annually on the 24th of September. This day aims to raise awareness for cancer research and its objectives, which include promoting equity in cancer care, improving treatment options, and reducing the global cancer burden. Thank you so much, Dr. Mahtaab, for joining us today. So, both genetic and environmental factors contribute to the risk of breast cancer. And genetic risk factors account for about 30% of all breast cancer cases. Tell us about this study. Is this the first study done of its kind in Black South African women?
Hi, Kudzai. Thank you. So yes, I want to start by with a little bit of background quickly, just to explain that Megan already mentioned the fact that the type of study we did is a genome-wide association study. And historically, these genome-wide association studies, or GWASs for short, they've been done predominantly in European populations and non-African populations. And so for the past maybe 20 years, they've been focused on non-African populations. And so the West is pretty much done with GWASs. And we've discovered now that results from the West, from non-African populations, aren't really applicable to resident African populations. And so, yeah, we are the first cancer study group to do a GWAS in a resident Black South African population in breast cancer specifically. And so this is the beginning of what we hope will be a long journey to discovery in genetics and cancer.
Well, thank you so much for that. In your study, it says you identified 2 genetic variants that were not previously linked to breast cancer. What role might these variants play in the disease, and how can they influence future treatment options? Perhaps you can also tell us what this means when you say 2 genetic variants that you identified, just to make it accessible for everybody to understand.
Sure. So when it comes to genetics, we know that there are changes in our genome, in your genetics, that can affect whether you would inherit or develop a disease. And in this case, we're looking at cancer. So in cancer, there are two very distinct kind of types of cancers when it comes to genetics. You have the inherited cancer. So that's the cancer that if it's in your family, if your mom has it, or if your grandfather had it, you would be on high alert. And you'd know that, you know what, this is in my family. This is there's a high chance of me having it. And we call that the hereditary type of cancer. You then get the other kind of cancer, which accounts for most of the cancer incidences that we see. And this is due to common genetic variation. So it is due to a lot of the genetic changes that we see in our genome that just occur randomly. And so it's just your luck. If you have the unlucky combination of these genetic mutations or these genetic changes that can increase your risk to developing breast cancer, then that's just, it is what it is. So it's not linked to whether someone has it in your family. It's just the combination of genetic changes that you have in your genome. And that's what we were looking at. So this is a little more complex to study. And what we initially did, what we essentially did is we looked at the entire genome. So all the genes that a person has in their genetics. And we tried to find whether there were genetic changes that were more present in people with cancer than people without. And that is how we discovered these two genetic changes or these two genetic variants in the South African Black population. And we looked at women from Soweto specifically. And so these two genetic mutations were in between two genes. The first one was in between two genes, and the second one was within one gene. And we know that these particular genetic changes haven't been found to be linked to breast cancer before. So there have been many breast cancer genetic studies, there have been many GWASs, and these particular mutations or variants haven't been found to be associated with breast cancer. So that was a big find for us. And these mutations are linked to the one gene that it's in, I think it's RAB27A or RAB27A. It is linked to the spreading of cancer, so the metastasis of cancer. And the second one in USP22 is also linked to a lot of cell things, so the growth of cells, but more importantly, it's also linked to some sort of so prevention. What's the word? When your treatment doesn't work. So it's linked to the resistance to chemotherapy, but particularly in triple negative breast cancer. And so I think, even though this is very, very early stages of discovery, there is a potential link to be able to use this information for cancer treatment, but also trying to identify women who might be at higher risk of developing breast cancer, given the nature of the type of cancer that we're looking at.
That definitely sounds interesting, right, Megan? What are your thoughts?
Yes. I know. I think I was about to just say exactly the same thing as you. So, I mean, that's something that it is an amazing thing. So in terms of how does one actually determine one's risk for breast cancer? Would we do these tests? How does it work, if I may ask?
You mean in terms of predicting whether one would have cancer or not?
Yes, or a high risk.
I mean, that's the dream, right? So currently we're and that's, I hope I can see that come to fruition. So currently, because this is the first GWAS in sub-Saharan Africa for breast cancer, we're literally taking the baby steps to getting to that stage. So we need bigger studies. And we need these studies in more populations within sub-Saharan Africa. But the idea is to be able to use these genetic variants that we identify, and I'm going to call them high-risk variants. So by identifying a number of high-risk variants, we can then predict whether someone would be at a higher risk of developing breast cancer or at a lower risk of developing breast cancer. So ideally, you would picture someone coming into a clinic, taking a little blood sample from their pinky, and because we know what the high risk variants would be, you then you read their DNA to see whether they have those high risk variants or not. And if they do have the high risk variants, you would advise them and tell them, okay, you're at a higher risk of developing breast cancer. You need to be wary. You need to go for mammograms a little more often. You need to be doing self-examinations more often so that we can catch it before it gets too far and before it's treatable. So that is the dream ultimately, and that sort of, just to give you a little a technical term, that sort of thing is called a polygenic risk score, and so this risk score is what we hopefully would love to implement in a clinical setting.
And I just find it's like we've just hit the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? And when you've mentioned that whole that term now, that polygenic risk score, I actually was finding that very interesting, because it says here that it was developed. There was a risk score developed in Europe, correct? And it failed to predict the breast cancer risk accurately in African populations. Is that so? Okay.
That's right. Yeah. So like I mentioned, GWAS have been done in Europe for a very long time, and so they've developed these scores, and some of them are using it even not in cancer, but even in like cardiovascular disease. So we tested a risk score that was developed in a European population, in our population from Soweto, and we found, like you said, it didn't work. And we know it didn't work because we have a very high amount of genetic diversity in populations within sub-Saharan Africa. So this just means that the types of genetic variation that we see in we see a lot more differences in sub-Saharan Africa compared to the rest of the world. And because we see these changes, not everything that is found in a non-African population can be applied to an African population. And that's where the problem comes about. Is so you may have done all the studies in a non-African population, you may have created these risk scores in a non-African population, but when it comes to applying it to an African population, it doesn't work, because non-African populations don't capture the genetic diversity that we see in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's the problem we face, and that's sort of the next step in breast cancer or cancer genetics as a whole, is doing more research in populations within sub-Saharan Africa.
It's just cutting edge stuff. And then, there was also the mention of these two major initiatives, the Johannesburg Cancer Study, correct? And then is it the Africa WITS In-Depth Partnership for Genomic Research Study? So can you maybe just explain to us, I find it interesting how these studies worked together. And yes, just maybe first that, and then why investing in the African genomic, research infrastructure is actually so vital to us.
Yeah, so the Johannesburg Cancer Study, or the JCS, has existed for a very long time, and this study collected samples from people with cancer, and it was 3 different cancers. If I'm not mistaken, it was breast cancer, esophageal cancer, and cervical cancer. And so these samples were collected and they were stored, and we had access to these breast cancer samples. So, we had this blood that we were able to extract the DNA from and send it for sequencing, or to read the DNA. And so those made up our breast cancer patients that we looked at. And then the other study you mentioned, is the AWIGEN study for short, because it's quite a mouthful to say the entire thing. So the AWIGEN study was started by WITS, and it basically was trying to aim to bridge that gap between genomic studies, because there weren't many available in sub-Saharan Africa, let alone South Africa. So AWIGEN aimed to collect a lot of information, genetic information, but also a lot of other information that surrounded metabolic diseases. And so they collected all this information from 3 sites in South Africa, so Soweto, Dikgale, and Agincourt. And then they also collected samples from East and West Africa. So we didn't cover all of sub-Saharan Africa, but we tried to cover as much of sub-Saharan Africa that we could. So there's a bit of representation from all around the continent. And so we had our breast cancer patients from the JCS, and then we compared the genetics from the cancer patients to the participants without cancer. And the participants without cancer came from the AWIGEN study. And what was really great is that both studies had participants and patients from the same region, which was very, very important, because even within South Africa, we see a lot of genetic diversity across the entire country. And so having specificity, even in terms of that, was very important to the study.
Wow, like Megan said, a lot of information, a lot to grasp and a lot to sort of get thinking about. But what I've noticed in our conversation is that there's use of the word genome. Do you have a simple way to sort of explain to us what you mean when we talk about genome? Do you have, just to explain it a little simpler for our audiences?
Yes, of course. And thank you for asking that. We forget that words that seem very simple to us are not actually simple. It's jargon. So genome refers to the entirety of all the genes that a person has. So within your cell, within your nucleus, you have all the genetic information that you inherit from your parents, and all of that genetic information as a whole we refer to as a genome. So the genome is made up of many different genes, and all the different genes do different things in your body. So they make you who you are.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahtaab. So with Africa's unparalleled genomic diversity, as you just explained to us, do you think that we're just scratching the surface in terms of disease risk discovery?
Yes, Kudzai, absolutely. I think we are only realizing how much of genetic diversity exists in sub-Saharan Africa. And yes, we're scratching the surface because there is so much. And what we do know also now is that we can't take one population in Africa and use that genetic information or the results from a genetic study from that population. You can't just apply it to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. And like you said, that's because of the great amount of genetic diversity that exists. So genetic variants that might contribute to breast cancer risk that are found in South Africa might not be applicable to a population in East Africa. Similarly, would not be applicable to a population in West Africa. And so while we're sitting on this golden pot of genetic variation, we need to now dive into it and discover and do the research within these populations specifically to be able to identify, the risk variants that are associated with cancer to start with, so that it can help in terms of risk management, but also diagnosis. I mean, cancer has been pivotal in the study. We definitely do need funding to be able to carry out studies like this. And one of the things we are planning on doing is increasing the study. So we're currently working on a study called Confluence, and the study is going to include breast cancer patients from around sub-Saharan Africa, but also the world. And their aim is to do just what we've been talking about, and that is to focus on particular populations, but also increase the amount of genetic knowledge that we have in different populations around the world, but also in sub-Saharan Africa. So we are taking the steps to get there, slowly but surely.
And I think that's such an important point also in terms of starting this and seeing how we start looking at, could we actually coin it more personalized approach to health and to care? Especially now we're starting to look at different cultures and communities and saying, well, that might work for these people, but look what we've found here. Their genetics are different, and with these variations, we can pick up more risk factors. Would that be basically where we're going with this?
Absolutely, Megan. I think personalized medicine is the future, and that is absolutely where we're heading. We want to be able to tailor predictions, but also diagnoses as well as treatment based on your genetics, and this is the start of it. Hopefully, this is the beginning.
And Cancer, so excited, just to have been one of the funders in this, and as our Type A research project. And for anyone that is listening in, and to Cancer on the Couch today, do you know that Cancer does do funding for both CHB, basically researchers and PhD cancer researchers based at South African universities and research organizations. We really look forward to being part of this going, and seeing how it unfolds. And everyone actually, their risk, like you say, reaching for the stars, that's where we want to head, be reduced significantly just because of studies like this. So I'm going to hand over to Kudzai. You might have something else you want to add. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this?
Megan, it has been such an interesting podcast today, especially learning about all this population-specific and working towards an individualized care method where you can have that kind of research from as Dr. Mahtaab said, just from the prick of your finger. So we're so excited to the future and to see what other research comes through from these studies. Otherwise, wow, a lot to chew on, I want to have a listen to this again and really try to understand and read more about this research that has come out. As Cancer, we are very proud that we're part of that research, and we look forward to having more researchers coming to our podcast to talk about the research that they've done. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Mahtaab, and we are super proud of you and the work that you've done. And there you have it, everyone. From us on the CANSA Couch, until next time, bye-bye.